Hello, welcome. Welcome to this gathering. We're so glad that you're able to join us. My name is Greg Metzger. I'm associate publisher at New City Press and part of the team at Focolare Media. And we're happy to put together this evening's gathering on the vigil of the Feast of St. Francis. We timed it directly for that, and it was fun. As I was getting ready, I started to get photos texted to me from friends around the country that were bringing their pets for their pet blessing. So we knew that this was officially the beginning of this special time in remembering St. Francis. And we also wanted, really, we wanted to bring you all together in a really kind of an informal way for a conversation, to both share some information about some things that we've been working on and publishing, but also really a chance for you all to participate with questions that you might have related to St. Francis and to some of the things that we'll be sharing about. So from the very beginning, we want to encourage you to use the Q&A box. We plan very much to have a time, a good amount of time to answer your questions and to engage in a kind of conversation with you through the Q&A box. But again, thanks for coming and welcome. And I'm really excited to be joined by Jon Sweeney. Many of you, I think, on the call know Jon already quite well, but just in case, I'll just share a little bit about his bio and background. Jon is the editor of a new series that we'll be talking some about tonight, on the spiritual practices of St. Francis. He's the author of many books about St. Francis and Franciscan, kind of early Franciscan spirituality. And he's also the editor of Living City Magazine, a part of Focolare Media. And he lives in Milwaukee with his wife and daughter. And I'm just delighted to have this time to hear from Jon and be in conversation with him. So thanks, Jon.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Greg.
Yeah. So Jon, as we get started, I mentioned a little bit about your biography and your interest in St. Francis, and I thought it would be interesting for people to hear how that developed for you, both your interest and kind of growing appreciation for St. Francis.
It started for me very early, Greg. I read a biography of St. Francis when I was in high school, a book by a guy named Paul Sabatier, who was a French Protestant pastor, not a trained academic or scholar, but who then became really the dean of Franciscan scholarship in the late 19th century. And his book was published in the last decade of the 19th century and was immediately a bestseller all around the world and translated into every European language within a few years. So it was that book in English that I found in the library when I was a high school kid. And I was a pretty typical high school kid in that I was caught up in my self-image. I was caught up in popularity. I was caught up in dating and worrying about the zit on my nose and all those kinds of things, most of which were totally ordinary and experienced by everyone my age. But to read the life of Francis and to realize that he had been kind of a kid like that too, and had gone through this incredible transformation, had a strange, difficult relationship with his parents, with his family, went on to found what became the Franciscan order almost by accident. I was really caught up in this story. So then I sort of couldn't get enough, and I studied medieval history and philosophy in college, and then I went to seminary and I continued to study and to learn, and then I became a writer, and I dedicated a lot of my work to telling the story of St. Francis and St. Clare and the early Franciscan movement.
Wow. So a real personal dimension to it from such an early age. I actually never knew that. That's really interesting to hear. And so as that developed for you, Tell us a little bit about some of the writing you've done related to St. Francis and the Franciscan movement.
Well, the first book I did on St. Francis was just the second book I wrote as a writer, and it was called The Road to Assisi. And my publisher at the time gave it a sort of presumptuous subtitle, The Essential Biography of St. Francis. But the book ended up doing quite well, and it did quite well because it wasn't all by me. It was Paul Sabatier's biography that had had such a big impact on me when I was a kid. It was a book for adults, but I read it as a teenager. And what I did as a young editor, a young writer at the time, was that I went back through that book and kind of did a re-edit of how someone might edit it in the 21st century, and created a new edition of that book, gave it a whole sort of facelift, and then added lots of notes and explanations of things that perhaps were obvious to a writer in the 1890s, but much less obvious to a reader today. So that was the first entry I had into writing about St. Francis. And then I followed it up pretty quickly with a little book called the St. Francis Prayer Book that I hope some listeners, some people with us tonight might still remember. These books are still in print, but that St. Francis Prayer Book was quickly adopted by a lot of third order Franciscan communities. And then there was the St. Clare Prayer Book, and then a whole bunch of others. So, I mean, I've published maybe a dozen or so books about St. Francis and St. Clare and the early Franciscans.
And John, am I right that most of what you've done is to kind of bridge that gap there around kind of scholarship or history that might be a little challenging for the general reader, and you've kind of brought materials, brought resources to people with a lot of what you've done with St. Francis. Is that kind of a general sense of what yeah.
I have always said that I am sort of unashamedly a popularizer. You know, if you are a professor at a university or something, that's an awful word to use. You would never want to be accused of being a popularizer, because you're trying to do original scholarship. And I was involved in that kind of publishing on the publishing side for many years. And I saw how the audience was very, very small, and it was a kind of publishing with its own purpose, but not with a purpose that was more, frankly, sort of evangelistic. I mean, I have a real sort of heart of mission for the Franciscan message and the life of Francis and the way in which it can transform people, because I've seen it happen. And so I have always wanted to take the scholarship of Francis, because I wrestle with it a lot and I read the scholarship, but then I try to distill it into a form that makes it a whole lot more palatable for the typical reader.
Yeah. Well, and it really fits your own, I mean, that you were able to encounter something as a high schooler that you could understand and be changed by. So that kind of is a segue towards a bit of what we wanted to talk about tonight, which is what you've really begun to do with New City Press, related to some of the scholarship that we've published in the past. And so I'm just for the people on the call, I'm just gonna share my screen briefly. The scholarship that we're kind of known for in the Franciscan world is the Early Documents series. Most of it related to St. Francis, but also to St. Clare, and most of it pictured here, the Conformity series, and then 3 other volumes that related to St. Francis and the Early Documents. So this series has kind of existed as kind of a standard for people in research and learning about St. Francis. And John, if you could just kind of describe to us, in a way, take us back to our first conversation about what was your vision for how these materials might kind of be used in spreading more of the mission of St. Francis.
Well, see, I was hoping you'd leave that picture up there.
I'll leave it up.
So that blue one, I was just going to point to the blue one.
Sure.
Right there, the blue one. So that the blue one is the first volume in that series. The saint, there's the saint, the prophet, and the founder. Only the saint is pictured there. And so that blue volume there, you will find in every Franciscan house, English-speaking Franciscan house, a Capuchin monastery, an OFM gathering place, an intentional community that's founded by Franciscan sisters. You will find that blue volume because that is the writings of Saint Francis, the early texts related to the Franciscan tradition. And then there's two more. There's the saint, the prophet, and the founder. And they're big, fat paperback volumes. I mean, they were hardcovers when you first did them, but for the last 20 years or so, those 3 volumes were so foundational. And if you read Franciscan literature, mostly the kind of stuff written by scholars and academics I was talking about before, and they're quoting from the early sources in English, these are the volumes that they're quoting from. So it's one of the real jewels of the New City Press catalog. Those other volumes there, the conformity, are much more recent and relate to a whole different, slightly later text, and they kind of round out the series. But the important thing is that New City Press publishes all of these foundational texts and documents, some of which Francis wrote himself, and then others date to his lifetime. And it's the materials that people like me study all the time to understand Francis better, and then to try to communicate Franciscan spirituality and theology and principles and ethics and matters of justice and so on to others. And so my thought for you all a couple of years ago was that now that that series is complete, it would be great to find ways to pull the texts out of that series in little nibbles, because they're big fat volumes, and to organize them around topics that are important to the average, person in the pews, or topics that are important to Christian education more broadly. And so that was the idea. And so that's what we've begun to do. And the one that just came out is the St. Francis and the Problem of Possessions. So that's the newest one. So and there's the other one was new last year, St. Francis and the Way of Lent, because Lent was foundational and important to Francis in a way that went above and beyond what it is to an ordinary Christian.
So this was the idea. The idea was to try to present in a really accessible way, in a way that individuals could use in their own devotional reading, but also small groups could use with their own discussion groups, to kind of bring this material, frame it around different topics. And I think that these have been, just with your own, you kind of do a really nice job of framing each of the quotes that you're drawing on from the series. So I thought I might even just take a minute, because we just want to share this with you all, how this series, both where it comes from, but also how it works, because we really think it's something that will be a real benefit to you as you try to follow Jesus in the way of St. Francis. So I'm just going to share for a moment what the text looks like of these books that Jon is. So within each volume, and I'm going to be sharing from the most recent one, the one on possessions, Jon takes kind of a 4-week format through the book. And so here we are in week 2, the problem with money. So kind of engaging with this question. And Jon provides an introduction to that material, and then brings in a reading. So each week has 6 readings that Jon will give a short introduction and context for the reader, and then the reading itself, and then reflection, discussion questions for you as you go through it. So each of these flows throughout the week with the 6 readings. And then at the end of the chapter, for your seventh day, there's a prayer of intention or spiritual practice that Jon suggests related to what the week's readings have been about. So it's really, Jon's really kind of guiding you into this material in a way that we think is really unique and helpful, and was really something we had not done with the material in the series. So we just really, really appreciate the work Jon's been doing with it. And some of you that are on the call, I know, have already been using this material. So part of tonight is also a chance for you, if you've done that, to kind of share your experience. And if there's any questions that as you've gone through the volumes that have kind of emerged for you that you wanted to ask Jon, this was a chance for him to kind of be here with you in another way to answer any of those questions that you might have. But Jon, could you say a little bit, just with this possessions volume in particular, what you were trying to surface for the readers, and what kind of drove you to make some of the choices you made about the framing of the book?
Well, I'll answer the question really personally, which is to say that ever since I had that encounter with St. Francis as a teenager, and then I was very quickly then a young adult who got married, started having children at a young age, and then was faced with things like rent versus a mortgage, what kind of car to buy, how much to drive, what kind of profession to pursue, the kinds of things that, you know, thoughtful people take their time to try to do the right thing, to follow their values, and to hopefully discover their vocation and to pursue it in a way that will bring glory to God through their life. That makes it sound very grand, but I mean, that's probably the right language. I mean, that's what a lot of us try to do. We don't talk about it that way necessarily unless we're in church, but that's kind of what we try to do. So I'm now 56 years old. So for 38 years, I've been struggling with, living with, trying to live the principles that St. Francis makes clear through his life and through his teachings, which, by the way, are pretty much identical to the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, which is the reason why Francis is usually referred to as, you know, the sort of the most accurate, sincere, spot on Christian in the history of all of us. But anyway, I have failed miserably many, many, many times. And when I give retreats on this material, I spend a lot of time talking about my own failures. And I could give you a story from today of failing in this area, because I had a failure in this area today. I live around a lot of homeless people. I sometimes fail terribly with them. I've gone through all the iterations of arguments about rationalizing and justifying why the teachings of the gospel, of the Sermon on the Mount, are not to be taken literally. And I've argued with St. Francis in a way that his early friars, his brothers, his spiritual brothers, ended up arguing with him. But then I've also had times in my life when I lived with great faithfulness to those ideals, and I saw the beauty of it and the joy that comes from it. And so, I mean, I've struggled with these teachings my whole life, my whole adult life. And so when I'm putting together a book on, you know, St. Francis and the problem of possessions, my fear is that some readers, and I've heard from a couple of readers who have told me this, that some readers are afraid of such a book, or they think, oh my, it's just a book that's going to make me feel guilty page after page. Well, that's not my intention at all. And I don't think that's the way that I lay out the material. And it's not the way that I ask questions at the end of each of the short little chapters. I reflect on the sorts of things that, you know, reflect the kind of thing I just got done saying about my own life. But you have to sort of struggle with the text. And so there's no reason to come to this series that we're talking about if you're not interested in having a serious conversation with the texts of the early Franciscan tradition and the values of St. Francis himself. I mean, if you're not interested enough in the Franciscan way to do that, then this is not the series for you. But if you are interested in those things, and I think a lot of people are, St. Francis of Assisi is the world's most popular saint, and there are hundreds of thousands of people who will raise their hand and say, I am Franciscan in one way or another. But so if you are, then you have to struggle with the kinds of things that are the chapters of the book, like the problem with stuff is the subject of week number 1. The problem with money, which is the subject of week number 2, because stuff and money are different in the life of Francis and in Franciscan tradition. And then reimagining a vow of poverty. What might it mean? The Franciscans themselves in Francis's own lifetime were reimagining the vow of poverty and arguing about what it meant. So it's an old conversation, and it's a conversation that is never boring and never tiresome, because it cuts right to the heart of the gospel life. And then the last week, week number 4, is living poor for others. And I try to be very honest about what that means, because I live in a house and I drive a car, and I'm not living a Franciscan life in the way that Francis did. So there are ways in which we all have to find what we are called to in the sense of living poor for others, and what does that mean? So anyway, that's a long-winded answer to your question, but it's a personal one.
Sure, no, it's really helpful, and it really gets at what I think is unique about the book, that you're tackling and bringing in this tradition, but also trying to do it in a way that is reflective and rooted in the kinds of daily struggle that people have in living the gospel of Jesus, living the way of St. Francis. And so, no, I really appreciate you kind of opening that up for people. So as we start to think about the question and answer time, I wanted to just ask you a question that kind of emerged for me in the course of it, which is just kind of how you, in your reimagining a vow of poverty, what was that process like for you to do that? To me, that was a really intriguing section, and I was just curious if you remember. It's been a little while since you did this book, but what that was like in putting that together.
Well, reimagining a vow of poverty, you have to start with where you are, where you live, and take a close look at your values. And for me, it's really a daily thing. Every day I am faced with, do I give something away? Do I keep it? Do I purchase something? Do I not? Do I borrow it? Do I get in the car? Do I drive too fast? Do I present myself as someone who's in authority, or am I willing to be small? Am I willing to be the person who is not heard from? There's all different ways of approaching the Franciscan values, the values of St. Francis, as it relates to being poor, and to identifying with the poor, and to being small. He wanted to be little. I mean, that was his intention. To be vulnerable. He wanted to be vulnerable. And that's not something that we learn from our parents. I'm the father of 4 children, and I will be honest and say I did not raise my children to be vulnerable. Exactly the opposite. I taught them to walk with confidence and to speak confidently. In school, the last thing I want is my child to be picked on, or for them to feel embarrassed, or, to feel little, to feel small, to feel vulnerable. It's really difficult to deal with that subject when you're talking about a child, but it also makes it difficult for all of us because we aren't raised with those values. We aren't raised with the values that come from the Sermon on the Mount, that come from the Franciscan tradition in the life of St. Francis. We have to almost sort of learn it as adults and unlearn some of what we've been taught as children. And so anyway, I face it every day. So I went through many years in my life never owning a home, because I was trying to live by Franciscan values, and I was convinced that that was inappropriate. And if you are absolutely living the way of St. Francis, it would be inappropriate to own a home. And I could get into that in terms of the texts and the tradition. But it came to a point when my wife no longer really agreed with that. My children didn't necessarily agree with that. And I made the decision that I would find other ways to live a life with and for the poor. And so this is not a Zoom call that's all about me, but I'll just say, for me, it's a lot about being open-handed, living open-handedly, saying yes. If you ask me for something, it is my spiritual practice, I hope, unless I fail, to say yes. So there are ways in which we can live for others and live a vow that relates to Francis's vow of poverty, which was very severe in the 21st century, living in the places where we live, in North America.
Great stuff. I'm really struck by what you're saying about smallness, about being small. In fact, I'll double back to that towards the end. Listen, Jon, we have a beautiful question here. He says, "Hi, friends. So happy you're doing this. Thank you. We're happy we're doing it too. I'm wondering, is there a St. Francis story that is less known that really stands out for you? And perhaps we can benefit in hearing it as we seek unity and a closer relationship with God." So, Jon, any lesser known story that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I mean, there's all kinds of stories, of course, and I'm not sure what one that is lesser known for one person might not be for another. The first thing that pops to mind, I think, is perhaps popping to my mind because it's my passion these days around the themes of St. Francis that I really want to learn from and I want people to hear. And it's all about gentleness. So, there's a lot of great stories about Francis and gentleness. And I think most people don't know these stories about Francis. So, Francis went through this terrible split of a relationship with his own father. And such that when Father's Day comes around every year, I always go out of my way to tell people that if you have a difficult relationship with one of your parents, if, unfortunately you have a parent who died who you were never reconciled with, if you haven't talked with, a family member in a long time, you should realize that the world's most famous saint, St. Francis of Assisi, had an unreconciled relationship with his father for the rest of his life. He had this dramatic scene in front of the whole town of Assisi where he grew up, where he had this dramatic split with his father. And Francis was a person of big gestures and sort of demonstrative. He was kind of a, rip the Band-Aid off very quickly kind of a guy. And he went off on his own and said, "I only have a Father in heaven." So he went from this very sort of difficult relationship with his family of origin and found brothers and sisters and siblings who were going to be devoted as he was to all the values that we've been talking about, and then started to sort of transform Europe and parts of Africa and the rest of the world. But what happened toward the end of his life was he discovered this incredible gentleness. It's like you see Francis evolving from one person to the next. And what started out as reaching out to the leper and to the human in need then became this gentleness in the world with other creatures, non-human animals and other creatures, and even inanimate objects, And so to get to the question, some of the stories that I think people don't know are, I mean, everybody knows that Francis preached to the birds. That's the one thing that we all know, that he preached to the birds, but it goes way beyond that. Francis would purchase doves in the marketplace, and then he would let them go up into the sky. This is the time in his life, towards the end of his life, when we see him in a rainstorm out on the road, finding the earthworms that have been flushed up out of their holes from the water up onto the to the road, and he's taking them off the road and putting them back in the grass because he cares so much about these little creatures. These are the times when we see him caring for bees. There's this great story of Francis out in a boat with a fisherman who wants to spend a little time with Francis, and Francis is teaching with him, and they're out on the lake, and the fisherman catches this great fish, and he presents it to Francis as a gift, and Francis kisses the fish and puts it back into the water. And the fisherman wasn't very pleased with that, I'm sure, because he thought he was giving Francis a great gift that would then feed him and the friars, for dinner. Now, some of these stories get a little bit silly, and I'm willing to acknowledge that. I mean, like when the fish goes back into the water, the story goes on in one of the textual traditions that all the fish then come to the top of the lake and they bow to Francis. So, I mean, sometimes it gets a little bit silly because hagiography, the writing of saints' lives, especially back in those centuries, tended in those directions. But there's no reason to think that Francis did not have a profound, intimate, firsthand connection of gentleness to the world around him. And it's something that we really need today. I mean, we have so much noise, so much violence, so much hurry, so much pollution, so much, I mean, you could fill in the blank for me. There's even a story of Francis telling the friars that they should walk reverently over rocks, which is like so anachronistic. I mean, there's no one in the Middle Ages who was teaching any Christian. There was no seminary where you could go and study. There was no bishop who was giving a sermon about walking reverently over rocks. I mean, it sounds Buddhist, right? But this was Francis's way of being in the world. It goes back to that smallness that we were talking about before.
So good, John. What a beautiful stories. And and people put in other questions, please. We really welcome them. It prompts for me another question, which is that Pope Francis, Laudato Si, the Franciscan roots of that, and the expectation, I believe, that there's going to be kind of a 2.0 coming from Pope Francis on the feast day tomorrow or the day after. Just wondered, if you've done reflection on that connection related to how you were answering that question and to Laudato Si. Putting you on the spot there, but just wondered.
No, that apostolic exhortation, Laudato Si, was the most important papal document in decades. And one of the things that I'm a little bit sad about, and I'm not alone in this, is that the American church really hasn't taken it to heart yet. Pope Francis now has the 2.0 version, like you said. It's publishing tomorrow, and I'm looking forward to reading it. In fact, the day after tomorrow, I'm going to be reading it aloud at the Catholic seminary where I spend some time here in Milwaukee, so that students and faculty and staff will start to take it in. But Pope Francis, who took his name for the Saint of Assisi, immediately wanted to bring this gentleness, and more specifically, this care for creation, into his papacy as an urgency, as an urgent call, something that Francis, understood somehow 800 years ago, but we have never responded to. Not only have we not responded to it appropriately, we just haven't responded to it at all. Francis was using the phrase Mother Earth 800 years ago. if you use that phrase in your parish today, someone will accuse you of being New Age or something. And you should tell them, no, you're just quoting St. Francis. So the connection to other creatures, the responsibility of human beings in the world to care for this earth, to care for non-human animals on the planet. This is part of Laudato Si, and it's part of what we're going to see tomorrow in the second apostolic exhortation that's coming. But it's the most essential piece of the legacy of Franciscan teaching for us in this moment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So you and I did not we did not rehearse this, okay? But this turns into a really kind of a segue to something that we did want to that I was hoping to mention tonight while we had people, and just kind of as you were explaining this from Pope Francis, it feels like a good moment to mention this. Partly because literally today, some of this book came to us, the final part of it. But we do want to let you all know that we have a resource that's coming out for the Christmas season. That is Pope Francis's reflections on the Nativity, very much flowing out of his appreciation, to say the least, devotion even to St. Francis and the Nativity scene. Something that he has written on and spoken about in a number of different contexts during his papacy, but that has never been put together into a book before. And so he and the Vatican produced this book, asked us to bring it into the English language for this Christmas season because of the 800th anniversary of St. Francis's first nativity. And so it's very much related to the Franciscan story and impact. And so I just wanted to just mention that to you that are on this call, that we will be publishing this book in November. I'm going to just share my screen briefly so you can see the cover that we have for the book. We're titling it Christmas at the Nativity. It's very much time for this 800th anniversary, but it's really a meditations on the different characters in the stories of the Nativity. It's the kind of rich pastoral, meditative, homiletical material that Pope Francis is really so appreciated for. We're just really, really honored to be doing it. And literally this morning, and this is what made me think of it earlier, John, was this morning we received the introduction that Pope Francis wrote, as we understand it, that he wrote it this past weekend. And it is really touching meditation that he's written for the introduction, that talks about smallness, that talks about this idea of being small, and the spirituality of St. Francis. So we're just honored to be able to do that this year. It's another of the materials that we're doing that have a Franciscan connection. And so we will, in the email that we'll send to you to follow up, in addition to the recording of tonight, we'll also send along links for all of the materials that we've talked about tonight, of John's work, the early document series, and then this new book coming from Pope Francis. So, great question, John. Question comes in: do you suggest a specific order in which the books in the series, I think he or she means the series that you're editing for us, in order that they should be read? But maybe you might also mention them in terms of the other series of the early documents, if you have a suggestion for how those might be read too. I'm not quite sure what she meant.
Well, the early documents series, I mean, let's be honest, those books aren't for everyone.
Right.
They are for every parish, library, They are for anyone who wants to study the texts of that St. Francis wrote himself and what some scholars have to say about those texts, and the earliest biographies and writings about Francis from eyewitnesses and those who were with him. So, I mean, if you think of yourself as a serious student of Francis and the Franciscan tradition, and you really want to, get in and learn more, those books are for you. But if you're just sort of more generally interested in Franciscan spirituality, those probably aren't the books for you. The only two that exist in the series that you and I are talking about, Greg, the Francis of Assisi Spiritual Practices series, are The Way of Lent, St. Francis in the Way of Lent, and St. Francis and the Problem of Possessions. So, I mean, it's kind of easy to put those into an order. I would do the one for Lent during Lent for sure, and I would do the other one anytime you have a group that's willing to get together and just be honest and talk about the challenge of being a Christian in the 21st century world and not ignoring the needs that are all around us. We are all faced with decisions every day, and if you don't think you are, then you're not conscious of what your responsibility is in the world as a Christian. And you could probably use to reflect with St. Francis on some of those issues.
Just to say in the other series, I think probably the one, if you were going to read and draw on one single one, it would probably be the one that we have pictured there, the Saint.
Oh, it would be the Saint. It'd be the blue one. Yeah.
You would agree, right? Okay.
Yep, the blue one.
So if you're looking for the one, it's the one here that's the blue one, the Saint. Start there, and then if you're ready for more, there's more. But if you're going to start with just one, it would be that one. And then just to mention, we also have, in terms of Clares of Assisi, we have a single volume in that series that's on her. We also have, and again, these will be in the email, but we have really helpful resources, workbook type of approaches that help to bring you into those early documents as well. So you'll also see those at our website. But we'll just do a last call for questions. But as we're doing that, it's funny, John, my dog actually just appeared too, and there's your cat has just appeared.
Martin loves a good Zoom call,
nice timing, yeah. John, do you have anything that we didn't get to that you'd like to share? Any kind of final thoughts?
Yeah, I'll leave you with a final thought. Something that I love about St. Francis. If anyone ever tells you that St. Francis was all about theology, tell them that they've really got it wrong. Francis was all about practice. He was very much sort of boots on the ground, actually bare feet on the ground. And what I love about him was that he was always second guessing himself. This was part of his smallness, is that he did not walk around with great confidence, feeling like he had all the answers. He walked around always trying to listen to what the Spirit had to tell him and to be receptive. So one of my favorite stories about Francis is one that we know because he developed a reputation for sanctity and some extraordinary action pretty early on, and a lot of the younger friars, were in awe of him. And Francis wanted to pray in quiet and alone a lot of the time, even though he didn't want to appear like he was special. So he would go off in the night when everyone was asleep so that he could be alone. It'd be probably his first time to get some time alone, but he needed that kind of time alone to recharge with God. And we know what he did when he would go off by himself, because we have the eyewitness accounts of some young friars who I can just picture sort of peeking through the bushes to spy on him.
Right.
And they say that Francis would be out in the dark, and he would put sorry, Martin. And he would put his arms up like this, and he would say, who are you, Lord, and who am I? Who are you, Lord, and who am I? And I just think that's so powerful, because this was, the great Saint Francis of Assisi, and throughout his life, he continued to ask God, who are you, and who am I? And I think it's a great exercise for all of us.
Thank you. Listen, just at the very last moment, a question came in. I'm not sure if I personally would not have any answer for this. I'll just put it to you, but if you may well not either, John. Question asks about noting that Pope Francis did public presentations on discernment. Do these presentations support our additional discernment about Franciscan spirituality? Like I say, I personally was not aware about that series. It sounds very good. Discernment is a huge part of both his Ignatian and Franciscan dimension. He mentions it in this introduction that I was saying that we received today that I was reading. But I personally don't know about those addresses. I'm not sure if you do.
There's all kinds of messages from Pope Francis about discernment, and very related to it, the formation of conscience, and how these are essential activities for all of us. But I don't know specifically about Franciscan sources that he quotes when he does this. It is interesting. I mean, I'm sure everybody knows this already, but it is interesting that this Jesuit cardinal, did not name himself for a Jesuit named Francis, but for a Franciscan Francis. And it was often thought for centuries how presumptuous that would be, that no one would ever take the name Francis, because how could anybody possibly live up to such a name? But Bergoglio saw the needs of the church and thought that the solution for them wasn't necessarily, Bergoglio as a miracle worker or something, but the charism, the spirit of Saint Francis of Assisi. I just wish we would all catch it like a fever a little bit more than we have. But the Pope's doing his best to try to make sure we do.
I was struck, just to mention this as we're closing, I was actually struck just yesterday. I saw a photo. I've been following there was an ecumenical prayer service for the synod that the Taizé community led in St. Peter's Square. And so I had been following that, and there was a photograph from that prayer vigil in which it was noted, because in the photograph, Pope Francis is underneath, the cross that St. Francis would have prayed under. And so they noted
San Damiano cross.
Yeah, they noted that he intentionally put that right in the center for this prayer gathering. So it's really a striking image of the unity. There's a number of representatives from different Christian churches there for that, and then the cross behind them. So maybe that's a great image to leave ourselves with.
Well, and you remember what Francis, the original Francis, what he heard. It was the first time he heard the voice of God, what he heard from God when he was praying before the San Damiano crucifix. He heard, "Go and rebuild my church."
Right, which seemed very, along the synodal lines. So it was really striking. Thank you all for joining us. My dog is kind of giving her note here that we're arriving at our closing time. Thanks so much, John, for your vulnerability, and also for the work that you've done in this series and in all your Franciscan writings. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. We'll be sure to send a recording of this out to you in the next couple of days.
Thanks.
Good night.